I was in their kitchen boiling oatmeal for my son Noah when my sister Brielle started laughing from the living room like she just discovered a new form of entertainment, hitting my child for fun. Noah was covering his head with his small hands, trying to shield himself while she smacked his arm again and again like she was adjusting fabric on a mannequin. "Stop flinching like a rat," she said, like he was beneath breath. I walked in, grabbed her wrist, and told her calmly, "Don't ever touch my son again." My dad stood up from his bar stool like he was being summoned for a performance, grabbed the steaming kettle off the stove with his bare hand, marched right toward me, and smashed it on the counter next to my face. Boiling water splashed, steam exploded, and I froze so hard I couldn't even swallow air. Please subscribe to our channel and tell us in comments from where are you watching this video? "You don't tell Brielle anything." His voice was cold, controlled, like a lecturer making a point. "You don't have a place in this house." "She does. Beauty deserves protection. You, trash, deserves fear." Mom didn't even flinch. She stepped around me like I was a grocery bag someone forgot to put away. "Accidents happen when trash competes with beauty," she said casually, like she was discussing weather. Noah ran behind me and started crying. My sister rolled her eyes. My father sat back down like the show was done. That day, something snapped inside me, but not in the dramatic movie way. It was in a quiet, structured, strategic way. The part of me that still begged for parents, it died. The part of me that needed them turned cold. I realized something important. They don't actually want me to obey them. They want me to exist below them. They want dominance, not relationship. And the deeper part, they want my son to inherit that position, because if Noah ever rises, it threatens Brielle's crown. Everything from that point forward became different. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize like their trained puppet. I simply watched them. I watched how they all thought Brielle was permanent, that her beauty protected her, that Dad was the judge of human placement, that Mom's approval meant reality was stamped official. What they didn't understand was beauty fades, control fades, arrogance blinds, but leverage outlives all of them. Because that day, I opened a new folder in my mind. I started documenting everything, the favoritism, the manipulation, the entitlement, the way they treated my son like furniture. They believed I would stay stuck in their hierarchy. They had no idea I was already building the exit and the return. Because this time, when I came back, I wouldn't come back begging. I would come back for revenge, not poetic, not symbolic, but direct, real, strategic, personal. And they would finally learn what happens when the trash they stomped on builds teeth. After the kettle, I stopped pretending the house was a home. I ate alone in my car. I hugged Noah on his small chair and let him tell me things he'd never say near his sister, the small confessions kids make when they're safe. And I learned how often he flinched, even when no one hit him. He told me he thought the house had rules that weren't written down, rules that said some people could get angry and some people couldn't. He asked once quietly, "Will Brielle ever stop?" I didn't answer with promises. I answered with plans. The first thing I learned was that anger without structure gets you nowhere. I had been angry for years, and every time I lost because anger burned out and their pressure stayed. This time I would be methodical. I would convert rage into tasks, small, boring tasks. Paperwork, training modules, phone calls, legal-sounding forms that made people stand in line like everyone else. I signed up for a night course in child protection and family services that started the following month. It was practical work, intake protocols, mandatory reporting lines, documentation standards, how to file a complaint that actually moved. I devoured it, not because I wanted to be an enforcer, but because I wanted the tools that made enforcement unavoidable. At the clinic where I went for my son's coughs and for my own frayed nerves, I offered to volunteer in the family support office. They took me on for odd jobs. Filing, making calls, running local referrals. Little by little, I learned how the safety net actually worked, and more importantly, where it didn't. I learned who in the system actually cared and who only performed the motions. I learned that the gap between people who deserved help and people who got help was paperwork and follow-through. I started keeping a private folder that was not paper and not emotion. It was a ledger, dates, incidents, audio notes I was allowed to keep for my records, photos of bruises or torn clothing when they'd left marks, names of neighbors who heard shouting, the clinic intake slips when I took Noah in because he'd been left with a fever. I labeled every file with times and short factual notes. No flourish, no rhetoric, just facts. Because facts are the language systems speak. When Brielle belittled Noah in front of their friends, I texted the names and the exact words to my private notes. When Dad smashed the kettle and sat down to read the paper as if nothing had happened, I wrote the time. When Mom told me I was trash, that went in the file with the date and any witness. I stopped answering their calls when they demanded cash. I started answering with forms. If you need support, provide the clinic intake, I typed. If you need transport, provide the times and the clinic name. My responses were boring and precise. They confused them. They used to get me to move mountains with one hysterical phone call. Now they were faced with procedure. It changed the dynamics in small but seismic ways. Their first instinct was to anger, to yell, to blow up the phone, to threaten. Then they tried people who used to give them favors. A cousin who once lent money stopped answering because I had told her the truth, calm, matter of fact, that they were taking money and not repaying. People who had been useful before had their own limits. The world I'd kept them afloat in was thinner than they believed. At the training, they taught us how to make a proper report. There was a template, what happened, who was present, what evidence existed, what immediate risk was. I had already started filling that template for myself without even realizing it. The teacher used the word threshold a lot, the place where neglect becomes actionable. I learned that threshold was not dramatic. It was a steady accumulation of missed responsibilities, repeated harm, and lack of mitigation. I worked an extra night at the cafe to afford a legal consult. It felt absurd. Me, making coffee for people who complained about the foam while I learned how to protect my child. But it was necessary. The lawyer explained restraining language, custody stabilization, emergency care provisions. She explained what a judge actually considered urgent and how a well-documented pattern changes outcomes. She told me what evidence mattered, medical notes, school reports, eyewitness accounts, copies of text messages. She explained how systems respected a clean, factual narrative. Piece by piece, I built that narrative. When Noah came home from school with a note that his teacher had noticed he'd been jumping at sudden noises, I filed it. When the pediatrician wrote an intake note after one of my emergency visits because he'd been left feverish while they celebrated a party down the street, I added it. Each piece seemed insignificant alone. Together, they formed a chain. And then I started to shift my life in quieter, smarter ways. I applied for a daytime position at the community center that handled early childhood education records. The job paid less than I hoped, but it gave me access to information and a regular schedule that was compatible with doctor's appointments. I learned how to request school welfare reviews, how to fill out a child protection referral correctly, how long the county took to react, and what language sped up response times. People keep thinking revenge must be dramatic, fireworks, but systems, legal, medical, educational, are slow and impartial. They won't burst your abuser's bubble in one night. They will, however, remove the cushions under that bubble so it hits the ground eventually. There were nights I almost lost it. I wanted to yell at them, to storm in and demand apologies, but the ledger taught me restraint. Anger burned hot and fast. Bureaucracy burned slow and long. I learned to prefer the latter. At home, they noticed the change. Dad's bar stool felt less secure when I walked into the room and didn't bow my head. Mom sent thinner insults. They were no longer wielded to control me, but to probe. "You think you're different now?" she sneered once when Brielle was hosting friends in the living room. "You think you can lecture us?" I didn't answer games. I filled out forms. I made phone calls to the center. I asked politely and plainly for scheduled welfare checks around the house. I asked for resources for parents and for reporting lines if anyone witnessed physical abuse. I did what felt like charity work in public and careful work in private. And the more I worked, the more I watched them act like children who'd lost access to a candy jar. They tried to charm, to bribe. Small favors here, the promise of visiting a sick aunt there. Brielle sent messages about how lonely she felt without family money. They begged relatives to co-sign for things. They asked neighbors for loans. The pattern of dependency was obvious. The true breaking point wasn't a single event. It was the slow collapse of the expectation that I would always be the fix. When my mother called at midnight asking for money for a last-minute flight, the kind of call that once sent me scrambling, I handed the phone to the volunteer coordinator at the clinic. I told her calmly, "You can show proof of the need and I'll note it. Otherwise, this is not an emergency we can assist with." There was a shocked silence on the other end of the line. My mother hung up. She tried again. I didn't take the call. She sent a text, begging, then anger, then threats. I filed it in the ledger with the date. At the end of the month, when I sat at my small table and opened the folder, the pattern stared back at me. Repeated neglect, repeated demands, repeated dismissal of my child's safety. It wasn't dramatic. It was undeniable. I turned the page and underlined a simple sentence I'd written for myself 2 months ago. When the time comes, I will not act from emotion. I will act from structure. I closed the folder. I breathed. The decision had already been made inside me a long time ago, on the kitchen floor in the spray of hot water. Now I knew how to make it stick. When I walked into the living room that evening and saw Brielle preening under the lamp, I didn't glare. I didn't snarl. I sat down and pretended to watch the TV. I began to plan the exact orderly sequence I would use if another hand hit my son again. Call the school, file a report, request a welfare check, and escalate to the Child Protection Office with the documentation I already had. I would not seek spectacle. I would seek protection. And when my mother made a cutting joke about trash and beauty, I simply wrote the words down in the ledger, date, time, witnesses, and folded the paper into the file. They thought they'd broken me with fear. What they didn't understand was that fear was a fuel. It was the thing I used to build leverage. The quiet plan inside me hardened into resolve. I would make sure my son was safe and that my family, for all their brutality, finally learned the cost of treating a child and a mother like disposable things. When I looked at Noah that night, asleep with his fist in his mouth, I felt something like a promise take shape in my ribs. Not a promise of vengeance for spectacle, a promise of removal. Remove him from harm, remove their advantage, remove their automatic access to my life. That was when I knew the next steps would be slow, procedural, and inevitable. I called Child Protective Services before I let my breath run out on another night of pretending nothing happened. The voice on the other end was slow and professional, and when I started reciting dates and facts, someone in a box across town began to treat my life like data instead of shame. They asked for intake details, for clinic notes, for the school's observations. I sent them everything I had been quietly collecting, the little ledger that had become the map out of our old life. The investigator came the next week with a soft voice and a clipboard. She asked Noah simple questions about school, about sleep, about whether anyone had ever made him do things that scared him. He answered in the small, honest way children do. He said Brielle sometimes hit him when she was bored, that Dad had shouted and made scary faces, that Mom sometimes told him not to cry because it ruined the house. The investigator's pen moved carefully. She said she could start a formal inquiry. That word, inquiry, made my parents' world wobble in ways threats never had. They had built themselves on raw entitlement, but entitlement has no armor against bureaucracy. When someone officially watches you, your privileges shrink. They tried the usual moves. Dad called and tried to charm the investigator like he charmed at family barbecues, telling the investigator our family had history and that they were very careful. Mom wrote an apologetic note she expected me to read and forgive. Brielle tried flirtation and fake tears with anyone who would listen. It didn't work. The investigator asked for proof, for witness statements, for the kind of consistency my ledger provided. The home visits began to be scheduled on regular days and times. They had to show up and answer questions. In the meantime, I got legal advice specific to custody and temporary protective measures. I learned the language of emergency petitions and how to ask a judge to restrict certain people from unsupervised contact. It felt clinical and cold compared to the life I'd known, but that was the point. This was not drama. This was safety. When Brielle slapped Noah across the face in front of a neighbor who actually called it in, the investigator had a new, immediate cause to act. The neighbor gave a statement. The school provided dated notes. The clinic had previous intake records showing repeated incidents. The pattern I had been cataloging became a chain the system could not ignore. They came and took statements. They scheduled supervised visitation for a time while they assessed parental capability. The court issued a temporary order limiting who could be alone with Noah. It was not a theatrical verdict. It was paperwork and process. But the result was seismic. The house where my son had been fair game now had boundaries the law respected. My parents raged, of course. They called me every cruel name they owned, and many they invented. They accused me of betraying them. They accused me of lying. My mother whispered on the phone that I had ruined their family. Dad muttered threats about what would happen when they saw the truth. Brielle posted a flurry of performative posts about being targeted. None of it mattered in court. The judge read the reports, looked at the facts, and wrote an order that mattered because it came from a place that enforces actions and records consequences. I wasn't trying to destroy them. I was trying to make them stop. The difference is the nuance people who enjoy cruelty never bother to understand. Removing their casual access to my child didn't punish them for spectacle. It removed their ability to hurt him without oversight. They tried to buy favor elsewhere, neighbors, distant relatives, anyone who could substitute their losses. A cousin who used to lend money stopped returning calls the day she learned the court had been involved. The church ladies who once brought casseroles when I was younger found themselves politely distant when they heard there had been a formal assessment. The safety net they had counted on as a lifestyle began to fray when it required corroboration and proof. There were tender, ugly moments. Mom stood at the clinic window once and watched me and Noah go in for his checkup. Her eyes were hollow in a way that had nothing to do with repentance and everything to do with the shock of losing automatic reward. Dad tried to come to a supervised visit once and had to sit in a small room while Noah played with blocks under a social worker's eye. He looked at me and then at his hands like a man realizing his tools had been taken. I did not savor their discomfort. There was no joy in watching misery that I once believed I caused. There was, instead, a steady, hard peace I'd never owned before. The knowledge that my son was safer and that the people who had trained themselves to ignore him had been forced into the kind of accountability they always denied. I rebuilt slowly. I took classes during the day and worked nights when I had to. I saved money in a jar and then in a bank account, each deposit a quiet promise to myself that we would not be at the mercy of their whims again. I taught Noah to say no and to tell an adult when he felt scared. I taught him what safety looked like in a world that had taught him fear. Those lessons were my everyday revenge, small and relentless and more effective than any spectacle. When my parents finally tried to cross a legal boundary, when Dad attempted to show up at Noah's school unannounced, the principal called me immediately and escorted Dad to the office. He was confronted with a clear policy and a firm staff. The principal, a woman who had kids of her own, told him plainly that until the court lifted restrictions, access would be denied without prior arrangement. He left bewildered and quiet, a man who had always used bluster and charm now facing paper and policy that would not bend. Months passed and their calls decreased. The rage leaked away into smaller attempts to manipulate. They sent holiday cards I never opened. They left voicemails I archived for the record. They learned that entitlement had a cost, and that cost was often the thing they prized most, people's willingness to put themselves between them and consequence. Sometimes, when the house was quiet at night, I thought about the kettle smashing and the way hot steam had clouded the kitchen like a warning. I thought about how I had almost let fear keep me under that steam forever. Then I would look at Noah asleep, the steady rise and fall of his chest, like proof that my choices had worked. Their life did not implode in a single dramatic scene. It eroded into complications, missing favors, relationships that refused to be used, neighbors who refused to lie for them. The social currency they once traded in had limits. You cannot fake community when community expects consistency. One spring afternoon, I took Noah to the park and watched him climb the jungle gym without looking back. He reached the top and laughed out loud, free of flinches and the small anticipations of harm. I pushed the swing gently and let the sun warm my face. Dad watched from across the field for a few minutes, then turned and walked away with his shoulders a little lower than they had been that morning. He stopped expecting the world to cushion him. Mom no longer tossed off cruel lines when she thought I wouldn't hear. Brielle kept her distance with a kind of brittle performative dignity that wasn't peace. I had not aimed to break them. I had aimed to protect my son and myself. The consequence was that they had to live with the reality of their choices. They could grieve it if they wanted. They could pretend it never happened. They could keep shouting the old insults into empty rooms. It wouldn't change that the safe parts of our life were now built on rules they didn't control. I sat on the bench and watched Noah run toward me, hair wild, cheeks flushed. He leaped into my arms without fear and wrapped his small arms around my neck. He whispered, "Mom, you're the best." No one else heard that except us, and the swing was still moving when I looked up. There was no dramatic mic drop moment, no viral reveal, no triumphant shout. Just a quiet truth. The day I chose to stop being their victim, I chose a different life for my son. And that was the only revenge I ever wanted. Please subscribe to our channel and tell us in comments from where are you watching this video.